Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. Today we're joined by St. Paul City Councilor Rebecca Noecker, who represents the capital city's Ward 2. Rebecca and I talk about why she got involved in politics, how her Judaism and politics mix, and what her aspirations are going forward in this week's Who the Folk podcast. Rebecca Noecker, St. Paul Ward 2 City Council member, representative, member?
Member.
City Councilor?
The woman, it goes all ways.
City Councilwoman?
There we go.
Rebecca Noecker, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
This is great. We are here in St. Paul. Beautiful.
In Ward 2.
In Ward 2. I was going to ask because it's not that I don't know St. Paul. I can navigate it pretty well, but the ward system, even the city I live, I don't really understand the ward system. Like, that's a sort of different thing to me.
It's not like critical knowledge probably for your existence, but Ward 2 is downtown, the west side, West 7th, and a little bit of Summit Hill.
Okay.
It's South Central St. Paul, but nobody calls any part of St. Paul South Central.
Do you feel better patronizing shops in your ward?
I do.
Do you feel like, not like restricted to your ward, but...
Well, I actually joke because I'm the only council member who gets to work in my ward.
Oh, really?
City Hall is in Ward 2.
Oh, very nice.
So I pretty much don't leave my ward. I mean, I hang out. I don't need to.
No.
So whenever I...
And it covers good territory. You shouldn't need to.
Exactly. It's by far the greatest ward in the city. And this isn't for publication or anything, right?
No, not at all.
Of course.
Nobody listens.
Just
it's
between
fine.
you and me.
Right.
Yes. But then, occasionally I get over to Ward 3 and I feel like I need a passport. And then if I ever cross the river, it's like craziness. I need a language dictionary.
See, when Minneapolis people make that joke, people get cranky. Like, St. Paul people get cranky. But you can make that joke because why?
I feel like it's fair. I don't know. I mean, I love our western suburb. Don't get me wrong.
You grew up in the western suburbs.
I did. I grew up in the western suburb of the western suburb, St. Louis Park. But I don't know. Actually, I actually think that's outdated. Like, most of the people, St. Paul's growing. We have 305,000 people. We have more people than we've ever had almost any time before, except in one part in the 60s. But we're almost above that.
Wow, that's great.
So people are pouring back in, and most of the new people you talk to, they don't get the Minneapolis-St. Paul thing. They see both of us as assets to each other.
Right.
So it's kind of like any joke from 30 years ago that you still sort of laugh at, but it's not really relevant anymore.
Fair. So what is it that, first of all, congratulations. I think we need to start with that because last month you won your seat for re-election.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And
it's nice not to be job searching on idealist.org anymore. It's hard.
Yeah. Now, I know every city's a little bit different. In St. Paul, is city council member a full-time job?
I get asked that question. I've been trying to figure out a better way to answer it. So it's called a part-time job.
Okay.
You make $66,000 a year.
Wow.
You have two full-time staff folks to help you out.
Okay.
And you represent about 41,000 people, which is more than the mayors of all the other cities in Ramsey County. So I do it full-time. Most of my colleagues do it full-time. I just would never want to have another job competing for my attention when I have this opportunity. Like, you only get 4 years, or I guess in my case, luckily now 8 years, but I want to pour my whole self into it.
Sure.
So I do it full time. Cause
I asked that because my experience is covering back in the day of a South suburban community where it really was very much a not quite side hustle because city councilors work really hard.
Right.
In the smaller suburban communities. Even this is a fairly large suburban community, but nonetheless, it was never intended to be a full-time job, even for the mayor.
Right.
So that's why I ask. I have no idea of how, I guess, demanding. I mean, I suppose the job is as demanding as you want to make it.
Right. I mean, that's what I love about it. And, you can choose to put in however many hours a week you want. I probably put in 40-plus hours a week because I see it as an opportunity to make – I mean, that literally you can do anything, you can't do everything, and that's been the hardest part about this job is just realizing how much scope there is to get stuff done. I'm someone who loves getting stuff done, and frankly, right now, cities have become the place where things do get done. Like,
Yeah.
I think the part-time councils are kind of back from an age where it was like, oh, you come in once a week, you look at the budget, you make sure the lights are on, you check the water quality.
You give a variance for a fence.
Make sure everybody's cutting their grass. Right. But now, I mean, cities have become like these laboratories where the new progressive ideals get worked out. Like, you can't, there's so much space to do stuff where, frankly, like the state and the federal government can't anymore.
Right.
So I don't want to do that half time.
No. And it sounds like there's, like you said, the cities are where things get done. It's the old adage, all politics is local. I think maybe, I think that's really, having covered city politics, that's really true.
Right.
I mean, like, people, the arguments I would get into with people over things like ice time for their kids' hockey team.
Right.
And people were just yelling at me over, how could I support this restaurant opening when it's horrible? How could I write something support? I'm like, wow, you guys really, really get into it. This is great.
Right.
It's kind of, I mean, it's not, and it was, the city I covered was in the city I lived in, so it was just really fun to engage with them in a way where I have no skin in the game.
Right. As a journalist, you have that.
As a journalist, I have that luxury. You, however, don't. So what led you into wanting to do politics in the first place?
I've always loved politics. I've loved the debate over how to organize ourselves to get along in this crazy world, to like decide how we are gonna make things happen and structure a society. Yeah. I've always kind of felt like, I took the red pill in the Matrix when I was in high school, and I suddenly realized, like, oh, everything around us is not default. It's someone decided to make it this way, which means we could change it if we wanted to. That was amazingly empowering for me. And when I think about sort of like where those decisions are made, I think politics is where the framework for how everything else in society happens is decided. And I wanted to be at that table. And then I've never shied away from, controversy. I don't mind taking responsibility for hard decisions. I don't mind attention. I'm terrified of like any athletic activity, but like public speaking, not a problem. So, it kind of fit. And I will tell you, I didn't know how much I would like it when I ran the first time. And I just love it. It's even the hardest parts are engaging, and they make me grow. So I really like it.
What led you to run in the first place?
So I'd always been interested in politics generally, and then when I moved back to St. Paul. I went to school in Boston. I worked in Baton Rouge for a while, worked in India for a while, moved back to St. Paul. Long stories there, and decided that I really wanted to get involved. I started as a teacher, a middle school science teacher was my first job, because I really wanted to be impacting society from the ground up, and I felt like starting when people are young was the right way to start, and I was just really bothered by all the inequities in education that I saw around the country. But I moved to St. Paul and decided I really wanted to get involved in my neighborhood, helping make my neighborhood a better place. And in St. Paul, we have these district councils that are a great local way to get really involved. So if anybody listening in St. Paul, consider running for your district council. And then I also got involved in the planning commission of the city, because we have these 22 commissions that you can just join as a layperson and start to figure out like how those parts of the city work. And between those two experiences, I was like, wow, local politics. I'd only worked on like national campaigns before, and I was like, this is actually where, to your point, like people care a lot. These issues matter. They affect people's daily lives. And when I found out that my predecessor, who'd been in office for about 20 years, was stepping down, I thought, I have a 6-week-old baby and a 1-year-old, and this is the perfect time. I'm going to throw my head in. And I didn't think I had a shot in hell, but I thought, I figured running was a win-win situation no matter whether I won or lost. Yeah. So I tried.
And you won.
And I ended up winning. It's surprising to everyone.
Was it really?
Myself included. Well, yeah, I was up against, it was a 6-way race. I was not, I worked in, campaigns, but I hadn't really been very involved in the party politics locally. Okay. And one of my opponents was the chair of the St. Paul DFL. I had some significant opposition.
That's some backing, even for a nonpartisan position.
Right.
Okay.
It matters a
nominally nonpartisan.
Right.
However,
we're a blue town.
Yes. Obviously, sure.
And not just the party backing, but just someone who'd been was a really qualified opponent. He's a friend of mine, someone I really like and respect. Yeah. So I just figured I was definitely the dark horse candidate, and my chances were slim. But again, I had talked to the council president right now, Amy Brenmoen, who's a great colleague and mentor of mine, had basically said, you will benefit from the experience no matter what ends up happening. Right. You'll build your network. You'll learn more about the city. So I just worked really, really hard. And luckily, the good news is, like, for people who are considering running for office, like, it's not like secret sauce. It's not pixie dust. It's just hard work and having real conversations with people. And that, I think, is what matters.
There's a lot of organizations that have started, largely in response to the 2016 presidential elections, right. That work, Run for Something, I know, is one where they sort of help mentor you,
right,
in terms of how do you fundraise, how do you form a campaign committee, all of the things that you need to run an effective campaign. But you ran pre-2016.
Right.
Did you
I
just
ran
sort
just
of
before it was cool to run? I'm always like not on the right side of the curve. Was it just the fashion trends late?
Was it just sort of winging it then, or did you just sort of? I mean, you at least had the experience as a volunteer where you had to have picked up something.
I will say volunteering on a national campaign gave me very little practical experience for running a local campaign. So anybody who's like attracted to the glamour, like, go do it. Do a 2020 campaign at the federal level. It's great, but like, it doesn't teach you the on-the-ground skills you need, except perhaps the hard work and the old saying that 80% of what you do on a campaign doesn't matter, but you don't know which 80%, so you have to do everything. That I learned from the federal level. But no, I ran right before there was a lot of interest in running at the local level,
right.
And I'm so glad there is now. But I did have still support. There's a group called Women Winning,
sure.
which is the local Emily's List kind of, and they were instrumental. And it is important to have groups like that because there's nothing like a campaign that you've done before. I mean, it's
right.
just a different language, different, not skill set, but different set of techniques you need to put in place. You need to find a campaign manager. I mean, none of my friends wanted to spend their spare time seeing me any more than they needed to, except for fun. I mean, it wasn't like I was going to... And most of my friends are not super involved in politics because, again, I was kind of coming in from outside of that world. So it was... I met my campaign manager, thank goodness, at a house party where I happened to be giving a short speech and with like 10 people standing around in the living room of a friend of mine. And I get an email the next week from this woman who'd been there saying, I don't know if you would be interested in this, and I've never managed a campaign before, but I heard you speak and I'd be willing to manage yours. And it turned out she was a complete rock star who'd like interviewed 10 other campaign managers before she reached out to me to learn what the job was like. And I would not be here if not for her.
Wow.
But that was total luck.
Yeah. You can't plan for that.
No, nor nothing else, frankly, that happens in a campaign, except for the fact that you're going to work your tail off.
Right. When you make a decision like that, obviously your kids were very little and get very little say in it, but it becomes like a whole family experience, right?
It does. Mostly I think at the local level, less in the sense of like a spotlight or like
right.
your name is getting dragged through the mud
right.
or stuff like that. And I do always, my campaign actually did get a little bit dirty. There were some negative pieces launched against me and against my opponent from our respective supporters.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's
the independent expenditure world.
Yes.
But my family didn't, it wasn't like their faces or names were plastered anywhere,
right.
but it's more just a sacrifice in time.
Yeah.
Now that I'm in office, I really try to only spend 2 nights a week out of the house. We keep Shabbat, which is a wonderful thing because I've always appreciated it, but I really appreciate it now, especially the turning off my phone part
sure.
for 25 hours. But the rest of the week, too, I try not to be out of the house more than 2 nights a week. During the campaign, that goes out the window. That's not. So my husband is amazing and was home for a year and a half straight with a 6-week-old and a 1-year-old.
Oh, God.
That's
a lot.
So I'm really lucky. You can't do it alone.
So did you grow up observant or at least keeping Shabbat?
Yeah.
This has always been a part of...
Yeah, I went to Jewish school through 8th grade. I was born in Boston, and I went to Maimonides for kindergarten, and then we moved to St. Louis Park when I was 6, and I went to Torah Academy from 1st through 8th grade. And then I went to St. Louis Park High School, but I continued taking kind of Jewish subjects on the side,
sure.
tutors and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a big part of my life.
How does your Judaism affect, or does it not affect, the decisions that you need to make as a city councilor?
I think I wouldn't say that there's a direct link where, I'm thinking to myself, well, on this budget issue, what does the Mishnah say?
Yeah.
But it's definitely influenced my values. I mean, my care for and concern for people who are on the outside. I mean, I think I'm constantly reminded. I was just talking to my kids this morning because there was a TV show they watched that said, I'm so excited for the holidays, and talked about the Christmas tree and the menorah on his table and the Kwanzaa, like a bunch of different holidays. And my kids turned to me with these like beaming faces, like, they mentioned Hanukkah, and I was like, it feels kind of good. So I feel like there's this, when you are a minority, you implicitly understand not what it is like to be in the particular shoes of a different minority, because obviously everybody's experience is different, but that general shared sense of most people are not like us, and our society isn't structured to accommodate us. Yeah. And it's hard to have that sense if you're not experiencing it yourself.
And you talked openly on your was your campaign website, not your city website, but you talk openly on your campaign site about your Judaism and the idea of tikkun olam and repairing the world, and how that has affected you not just as a candidate and a city councilor, but just sort of as a person and the things you did before politics.
Right. I mean, that has always been sort of in my blood, is the sense that you're here to work, you're here to give back. Things are not right around you, and so it's your job to make them better. I have 2 quotes that hang on my wall in my office in City Hall that my mom actually calligraphied for me. It's my first thing after I got elected. I'm like, Mom, I need some art. But one of them is, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor v'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. It's not your responsibility to finish the work, but you're not free to turn away from it, which I really appreciate, because so much of the work I do in office is not the kind of work that I'm going to finish, or that my children are going to finish, or that can be finished in a lifetime. But that doesn't mean that today at 9 a.m. when I open my email, I don't need to take responsibility for moving it a little bit further down the field. And it's easy, I think, to become overwhelmed by the scale of the kind of problems we deal with and just get paralyzed. That quote kind of reminds me, like, no, like, you can't turn away from this, like, move it a little further. And then the other quote is, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od, the whole world is a narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to be afraid. And that I think about all the time when we're making these decisions where, today in our political world on both the right and the left, it feels like you're going to fall off into chaos on either end, no matter what step you take. And you have to make a decision when you're in my position. So you can't be afraid.
Yeah. What are the biggest issues? You talk about the difficult issues and there is a lot of really hard work that cities do. What do you think the biggest things facing St. Paul are in the near term?
I think there are a couple of things. Affordable housing is a huge concern for every city, but it's becoming especially urgent here. We have a homelessness crisis. I increasingly hear from people who say, I want to move to St. Paul, or my kids want to move to St. Paul. We can't find a place to live. Yeah. Early childhood education and childcare is another huge cost for families. A lot of cities around the country have said, we're going to stop waiting for the state to fund this, and we're going to fund it ourselves, and we're going to make sure every 3- and 4-year-old in our city have access to free, quality childcare. I think that would be a huge economic development incentive for people to move to St. Paul, to open businesses here. We'd be the only city in the region that would have that outside of Chicago. Okay. So I'm working on that. Long term, I think financial sustainability is really key. Cities are always struggling to find new sources of revenue. Our budgets, every year, the expenses grow. We don't want the taxes to have to be the only way to capture that, to fund our expenses. But without more help from the state, without, frankly, more businesses to help support the cost, that becomes hard. So I'm always thinking 10 steps down the road in terms of financial sustainability. And then the last thing I would say that I'm really concerned about, and we saw it a lot with this election, is just public trust in government and feeling like their voice is heard, and understanding the difference between your voice being heard and getting your way, which I think is an important distinction that I try to help people make. But I just try to be a different kind of politician. I don't even really like the word politician because it always has a stigma, but trying to be really accessible, going out to community coffees and happy hours all the time, trying to help people see that your voice really does matter at the local level. Yeah. And it's not the man, it's me and some other people who've stepped up to serve. Let's do this together.
And I looked at the schedule you have on your website where you list your public happy hours and coffees and virtual lunches and all the things that you do. There are a lot of them. Like,
Yeah.
you do these,
Try.
right? But I mean, I think you want to be. I mean, it's very cliche, woman of the people. But these are your constituents, and this is your opportunity to be where they are and have a beer or have a coffee and have a conversation about what are the issues that matter to them and how can you help affect those.
Right. And frankly, I think there's a value to those gatherings that goes beyond just me hearing from them or them hearing from me. It's also us all hearing from each other. Mm-hmm. There's so few spaces, if you think about it, where you can go today and sit down across from your neighbors without an agenda, without all having to commit to some shared ideology or purpose, and just genuinely hear what's on your neighbors' minds. And more often than not, people come in with like their thing, the big thing for them in their neighborhood on their mind. And it's not that they leave and it's not important to them anymore, but they hear what everybody else's big issue is, and they leave with this understanding of, man, we are working, this is a complex city, there's a lot going on, my issue might be important to me, but their issue is important to them, and they just have this perspective that I think is broader from the conversations.
Right.
Sometimes we leave and someone's like, man, your job is really hard. I'm like, thanks. I mean, I love it, but the balancing all the needs is challenging.
And I think when you have a city government is still nonpartisan. I know not every city government. I don't.
It's generally.
Is it generally nonpartisan?
But
but being in a largely blue city, it doesn't become necessarily a politics of left or right or
left.
Not in my backyard. It's left, and it's not that it's not in my backyard necessarily politics either. It tends to be these are the issues laid out. What can we do together to fix them and get things done?
That's honestly, I'm glad you said that, because that's what I love about it. I would never want to be, at least not in today's climate, filling a seat with a blue rear end, and just kind of occupying the seat for my party and voting my party way. And when you're in the minority, nothing happens, and you wait until you're in the majority. Like, that sounds absolutely, utterly
dreadful,
awful to me. Instead, I have 6 colleagues. We're not partisan, even if we do have, political ideologies and supports. Every single issue, we need to build a different coalition. So I can't afford to alienate 3 of my colleagues and vote only with, certain people, because on the next issue, I'm going to disagree with the people I just voted with and need the other people.
I'm going to need the other group,
So we genuinely have real conversations, real disagreements, and I think we get to better answers because we're not just sitting there with our arms folded knowing exactly how we're going to vote no matter what.
Right. It feels how it should be.
It does. It's genuine. And I think size matters. Like, having 7 of us that's a size where you can really have a functional conversation. I don't think you can have that kind of conversation with 60, 100, 435 people.
Right.
But for the kind of work I like to do to actually get things done, I think that's the right size, and the city is the right space.
So, political aspiration-wise,
that's hence why I want to stay at the city.
Okay.
I love the city level.
Okay.
I could see myself running for mayor someday. I think that would be an amazing opportunity. But at least until things change nationally, I don't want to spend my time fundraising. I don't want to spend my time posturing. I can point to the achievements that I have in my first term and be proud of them. Mm-hmm. And, if I could represent 41,000 or 300,000 people, like, that's enough for one person, right?
Yeah, that's good. So you mentioned you sort of, before moving back to St. Paul, you college in Boston, Baton Rouge, India. How did you...
Yeah, it was all part of the plan. No, I'm just kidding.
What led you? What sort of took you around?
I saw a poster on my college campus senior year that said, "Do you want to make a difference?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And there was free food, so I was hooked. And I went.
And as a college student, free food is everything.
That's right. It stood out to me. So I went to the info session. It was about Teach for America.
Okay.
I ended up really liking the idea of being able to graduate and immediately be in my own classroom without further conversation, further training, further grad school. As I mentioned, I wasn't a huge fan of more education. I just kind of wanted to start making a difference.
Yeah.
So I joined the Corps. I chose Mississippi was my first choice, and Louisiana was my second choice because those were 50th and 49th in education in the country at the time, and I wanted to go where I was needed.
You were all about making the difference.
Yep.
Wow.
So I got Baton Rouge, and I just happened to meet a boy from Mounds View in Baton Rouge. So that's another story, and I didn't think I would move back to Minnesota. I kind of thought I was gone, and but he was looking. I think that's the only reason he married me. He really wanted a girl from Minnesota. That was it. That was
all he had to do was go to Baton Rouge, Louisiana,
and
to find it.
It's like your own backyard.
Sure.
Click your heels together 3 times, something like that. So yeah, so we met, and then I really wanted to live somewhere totally, just experience life in a totally different place. I wanted that perspective, and so the only place that would take me without a graduate degree was in international work was India, because they were starting a Teach for India program, and they wanted people who'd had experience at other Teach Fors to come there. So we lived in Pune, India, which is a tiny little town of 8 million people that nobody's ever heard of in India. And I traveled all around the country recruiting.
8 million people, tiny, nobody's heard of it?
It's like the 8th biggest city in India. I mean, nobody's heard of Pune. It's outside of Mumbai, about 3 hours. Anyway, it was a great experience. Great for kosher keepers because there's a lot of vegetarian food, and they even have little green dots on the food at the grocery store if it's totally kosher, no gelatin, nothing. So totally vegetarian, I should say.
Yeah.
But if that works
Good
for
enough.
you,
yeah, if that works.
So biggest English language circulation newspaper in the world, The Times of India, 1 billion readers. Yep. So it was a great place to live. And then we lived in Uganda for a little bit, volunteered there, and then made our way home. And really always wanted to live in the capital city. Love St. Paul, love the character. Won't say anything about any other city in Minnesota, but really love St. Paul. So
you really always have been an idealist.
Kind of, I guess. I've liked to make a difference, and I've kind of liked to do it my own way. chart my own path, I guess.
No, and I think that's amazing. So how do you have? Obviously, there's no term limits. Is there an idea in your mind of how long you want to, or is it just going to go until it feels not as good anymore?
It's a really good question. I don't know. I guess
not that I want to put a target on you.
No, right, exactly. Yeah.
X number of years down the road.
Opponents take note.
Yes.
No, I mean I felt like the first 4 years went by super fast. And my predecessor gave me, Dave Thune, who is another role model of mine, he gave me great advice when I was coming into the seat. He said, you only are guaranteed 4 years.
Yeah.
So don't act like you have another term guaranteed. Try to get it all done and, do as much as you can in 4 years. So I did that. But it felt like it went by super fast because the work just, any development project, any, new funding stream, any legislation, like those things take years to get underway. Often.
Yes.
So I guess I would not want to leave if I felt like there was something undone that still needed to be finished. But that's probably always going to be the case. I doubt that any work is going to perfectly coincide with the end of a term. Right. So I guess as long as I still feel like I'm doing meaningful work and it's the best place for me, and that my constituents still want me. I have no interest in being like the 8-term, like yawn fest candidate who people are like, oh, well, I guess Rebecca Noecker's running again. Even the second term, I was like, it was so different to be running with a record and to be the incumbent.
Yes.
And I definitely don't. We worked our tails off this time too, and didn't take anything for granted. But I would never want to be to the point where I'm just the assumed shoo-in.
Right.
So that'd be boring for everybody.
I think probably.
Yeah.
Well, Rebecca, last 2 questions, and we'll let you get on with your day of governing. Favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, no question. Pesach, Passover, my favorite Jewish holiday.
How
for
come?
Sure. I love eating inside for a lot of days, so that rules out
Sukkot's out.
It rules out, the shorter holidays. My bat mitzvah, growing up Orthodox, I didn't have a bat mitzvah where I read from the Torah or did any services, but I gave a Dvar Torah at my shul, and I led the Passover Seder. I trained with my rabbi to lead the Seder.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and it was wonderful. So I now have this like in-depth appreciation and love for the Haggadah that I don't have for a lot of other texts.
Sure.
And there's so much there, and I love how it's oriented towards education, towards kids. I think the Seder is just a brilliant innovation, religiously and educationally. So I love it. I'm not a fan of matzah, but I try, I avoid it for the most part.
No,
I find there's a lot of amazing, stuff in the grocery store these days.
It's getting easier to avoid it if you want to. Like you can still eat and be fine if you want to.
We're way past what was that awful cereal, Cheerios, but it wasn't Cheerios.
It was like the Manischewitz,
like
Matza-O's.
Matza-O's, yeah.
Maybe.
So those are in the past.
Yeah.
I feel like we're in a better place now.
I think so.
As a people.
I think so. Favorite Jewish food?
So this also is going to sound sort of weird, but I really like gefilte fish out of a jar. I know. I love gefilte fish.
We've had people say gefilte fish before, but never specified.
I like it out of a jar. I don't. The homemade gets a little sweet. There's not a lot of pickledness to it. Yeah. I like the vinegary pickledness. When I was really little, my first memory, actually, a Jewish memory, is that my dad, when we'd go to shul, and I must have been like 3 or 4, before Kiddush, would usher me in quickly because, the Kiddush lines get super long.
It gets really long, yeah.
So he'd usher me into the Kiddush room right after shul, sit me down in a corner, get me a plate of the little gefilte fish, like the balls.
Oh, yeah.
With toothpicks.
Yeah.
And sit me down with a little styrofoam plate and the gefilte fish balls with the toothpicks. And I would just kind of sit there eating and staring at people's knees as they got into line. And that's my earliest Jewish memory. So maybe it's not super
that's amazing.
Religious, but that's
great, though.
And so that I've just been, I was imprinted on gefilte fish at an early age.
That's awesome. Well, Rebecca Noecker, thank you very much for joining us this week.
My pleasure.
And congrats again on re-election, and good luck with your second term.
Thank you so much.
The Who the Folk podcast is a product of Jew Folk Inc. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, and review the show. If you have a suggestion of someone who should be on the show, please email me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. Also, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast to listen to our new shows, We Won, Let's Eat, the Jewish Food Podcast, and The Jews Are Tired, a weekly recap of Jewish news through an analytical lens. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.